till I can't no more.
I got the horses in the back. Horse stock is attacked.
In the coming week, the coronavirus continues to spread around the world. Israelis hold their third national election in the last year, and Democratic candidates for president compete in the Super Tuesday primaries. It's February 27th, 2020, in time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Stephen Cook, sitting in for Jim Lindsay.
Stephen is CFR's Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies. And as always, it's a pleasure forecasting with you, Stephen.
It's great to be here with you, Bob. Let's start out. What is going on with the coronavirus? This mysterious pneumonia-like virus that originated in Wuhan, China, has been causing concern beyond China's border as it migrates around the world. We've got serious outbreaks in Iran, in Italy, in Korea, and now U.S. officials are saying it's not a matter of if, but when the United States confronts its own clusters of the coronavirus. What's going on? Give us an update, Bob. This is kind of scary, actually.
Absolutely. You need look no further than the world markets to see how nervous many people are. As we're taping this, there's a fourth day in a row, actually, of steep market losses, Stephen. But it's much more important than the markets. Obviously, it's the knock-on effect, obviously, is global economy, which seems to be a very real thing. And the potential for a recession is mounting as well. What's happening on the ground is there are, according to the main trackers that people are looking at on this virus, are about 82,000 cases now worldwide. The vast majority still within China, although the WHO has now said that most recently, in recent days, the number of newer cases outside of China has exceeded the number of new cases in China. So that's a big change.
It's good news, I guess.
Yes, everything in context. But as you mentioned, Italy is extremely concerned. There's a great deal of concern about how it spread into Italy and how far it could spread. It's already had a chilling effect on sort of daily commerce in a number of places in Italy, and as well as nervous European neighbors. Europe's still primarily open border continent, and there's a great deal of concern about what that might lead in terms of the spread of this virus. The virus, health authorities say within China, it has had a mortality rate, death rate of about 2.3% or so.
Which is high.
Which is high. The flu is 0.1%.
0.1%. I mean, we've had many more cases of the flu, so there are more deaths as a result of the flu. But it's 20 times more deadly. Coronavirus is 20 times more deadly than the flu.
It appears to still be the case that those who are succumbing to this virus are infirm or elderly. It's not necessarily a reason to, sit back and relax, but health authorities are saying, look, this is something that is going to spread around, including into the United States, where there's only officially, I think, 60 cases recorded. And it could actually be part of eventually, some health authorities say, part of a normal flu cycle, sort of occurring as part of the annual, okay, it's time for the flu season. What are we going to do to prepare?
It's also time for the coronavirus season.
Exactly. The concern, Stephen, is that there's a lot of unknowns, including the contagion effect. How do you spread it? Could you show no signs at all and still spread it and never catch it yourself? That seems to be the case in a few cases.
Right, and we've just learned of a case in California in which this person has no connection to any of the outbreak areas, hasn't traveled, and has tested positive for the coronavirus. And now the CDC is furiously trying to trace who this person was in contact with during the previous 2 weeks. It's very clear that there's much more to be learned about this, and that we're going to see outbreaks in a lot of different places, including the United States. One question about the response in Europe. Europe has already been affected by a wave of xenophobic politics. Is the coronavirus having any effect? The fact that it's in Italy, you had a previous interior minister in Italy who was an avowed nationalist, wanted to keep immigrants out of the country. It's a vastly different situation, but you can see how it can play into this right-wing / neo-Nazi playbook in which they have tried to undermine open borders of Europe and the European project more generally.
Yeah, I think that's you're touching on a thing that's going to be watched very closely. There's a great deal of concern that sort of alarm and alarmism could seize the country. I mean, Italians themselves are saying the response in terms of the lack now of services and all sorts of canceled events or events happening with little attendance, take your pick from sporting events to other public events, is an overreaction. And that's an overreaction of one sort, but an overreaction in terms of circling circling the wagon, so to speak, or closing down borders, or turning against what has been the pillar of the open Europe is a real concern, I think, Stephen. Obviously, it was a driving issue for Brexit, which is now underway, the UK leaving the European Union because of concern about being inundated with foreigners seizing not only, say, UK resources, but their sort of sense of patrimony.
Although, of course, the UK leaving the European Union isn't going to hermetically seal the island. And I'm sure there'll be cases of coronavirus showing up in Great Britain.
Yeah, I think we should also note that as we're taping this podcast, there are new efforts in the U.S. to mount in a response after a lot of pressure brought on the Trump administration this week in Congress and from a number of other quarters in the country that they've been moving too slowly. The president had just last evening, Wednesday evening, had a press conference where he announced that Mike Pence, the vice president, would be in charge of the U.S. coordinating efforts to come up with a robust preventive process to collate all the different departments that are needed and coordinate for everything from resource allocation to communication and to responding where the most attention is needed. One thing that's a big concern right now is the lack of testing kits. I think there's only 3 states that are said to have adequate testing kits for this virus, and it's a very complicated process.
There's only 7 hospitals across the country that are partner hospitals to the CDC where you would go to get this test. This is a huge country. You only have 7 hospitals that can do it. I think that the Trump administration is going to have a steep climb to get itself in place where it can adequately deal with this, especially since they spent the previous 3 years essentially gutting budgets and staff that had been stood up by previous administrations to deal with these kinds of
especially in the National
epidemics.
Security Council. I think people have pointed to that in particular. And there's been a lot of comparisons to what the Obama administration did in response to Ebola, where it not only put up very effective sort of round-the-clock efforts to prevent the spread to the U.S., but was a leader globally in helping to spread and helping African countries where the most serious afflictions were sort of finally come to grips with it and suppress it. So I think it's a question of both the U.S. role in protecting the homeland, so to speak, but also globally, is the U.S. going to play a leadership role?
And I think just to ensure that we don't sound partisan here, the George W. Bush administration also had a very robust public health program and did extraordinary work in Africa with regard to AIDS and other diseases. So I think we're starting from we've put ourselves at a disadvantage by gutting those programs.
Yeah, I'll just note one thing in sort of wrapping up this part of the discussion, Stephen, which is, Twitter can be obviously a rabbit hole on all sorts of issues, but it is useful if you parse through what you're seeing there to some of the threads that are being put out in reaction to this virus. And I noted one that's being passed around quite a bit. It's a former FDA commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who has a thread, a very interesting thread to read this morning. He concludes by saying, "A therapeutic is possible and can be a break on this virus. The summer may limit its spread. An epidemic in the U.S. is far from inevitable. We can confront and conquer this virus. We can limit its impact on American lives, but we need to face it aggressively now. The moment is now." So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. We'll see what happens.
Steve, I want to turn our attention over to Israel. For the 3rd time in less than a year, Israelis will head to the polls to vote in a national election. The first one of those, and I believe it was last April, resulted in Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party receiving the most votes. The second resulted in Benny Gantz's Blue and White party receiving the most votes. Neither party, however, was able to form a majority coalition in the Israeli Knesset after those votes. And here we are again today with a vote coming up next week, Stephen. What should we be looking for?
That's right, Bob. Monday, March 2nd will be the 3rd Israeli election in less than a year. And so far, the polls show that the results that you talked about after the first and second elections aren't going to be that different from the results of the election on March 2nd.
So no horse trading going on since the last time.
There's lots of horse trading going on, but the polls are showing that Israelis are going to vote for either Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Likud party, which will get 34 seats, 35 seats, 1 seat more than Benny Gantz's Blue and White coalition, or other polls will show that Benny Gantz's Blue and White coalition will get 1 or 2 more seats than Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Likud. The problem is that they're going to need other parties to put together a simple majority in Israel's Knesset, which has 120 seats. The problem in the last 2 elections is, with the first election, Netanyahu is unable to get more than 56 or 57 seats. The same thing with Benny Gantz's Blue and White, unable to get enough seats to form an actual governing happening coalition. There's been tons and tons of horse trading and negotiation going on, but Gantz is sticking to his principle. He won't sit in a coalition. He will sit in a coalition with the Likud party, but
without Netanyahu.
Without Netanyahu.
Who himself faces indictment.
He faces a slew of corruption charges and has been indicted, and there will be a trial. And then Netanyahu is sticking to his efforts to build a coalition that is of the right. But he's got a problem in that he can't convince certain leaders like Avigdor Lieberman, who once served as his defense minister, to join his coalition, because he also needs religious parties to join the coalition. And Lieberman and the religious parties are sticking to principles that are apparently non-negotiable. So there actually is the possibility that we have a similar result to the other two polls, and that we'll be heading towards a fourth election. That is an actual real possibility. One more thing. I think after President Trump tabled his plan for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, there's an impression among Americans and American observers that Israelis are really voting on this core issue of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And I wondered about that, and I reached out to Israeli friends yesterday, and they said that actually that's not the case, that these elections are similar to the previous two and elections that have been held even before this cycle of elections, and that they're really focused on domestic issues, on inequality. Israel has one of the largest gaps between rich and poor, affordable housing, domestic issues, security issues that Israelis feel safe, but they're not voting on the Trump peace plan per se.
And is that partly because whether it's blue and white or Likud, neither gained a ruling coalition would pursue policies much different vis-a-vis the Palestinians?
That's exactly right. And that was the point that Israeli Contact was making to me, which is that really, in addition to these, domestic issues related to the economy, related to the relationship between religion and state, that it's an election about personality. That, if you look at it, Benny Gantz and other leaders of the blue and white coalition had served Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that what really their issue is not so much about policy, but about Netanyahu the man, and is he still fit to lead Israel? And so far, Israelis have demonstrated that they really can't make up their minds about what they want, and there's also this coalition building process, which makes it extraordinarily difficult. But blue and white and Likud are really running so close that it's very, very hard to tell how these things are going to turn out, and that's why there's so much emphasis on negotiation and horse trading in the coalition building process.
Final question on this. So we're almost entering a year of this kind of caretaker governing because of the lack of any clear winner. Is that having any impact on Israeli policy, governance, anything like that?
It doesn't seem to have had much impact. The Israeli economy continues to be strong. It continues to be a tech powerhouse in the world. The Israelis are continuing their diplomatic advances in the Middle East and beyond. And, at least for that, Netanyahu can claim significant victories. The Israelis have developed their relations with countries in the Gulf, with countries in Europe, with countries beyond, as well as there is a peace plan that has been tabled by the United States that is, I think, widely perceived to be, and I think rightly so, to be one that is drafted very much in Israel's favor. These are significant accomplishments on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Moving on, this week is not only an important election in Israel, but it's also a big election week here in the United States. This Tuesday, March 3rd, is what is known as Super Tuesday in the U.S. presidential primary race. Bob, what is Super Tuesday, and why does it matter?
Well, it's become a thing over multiple election cycles now, Stephen, in which a big block of states decide to hold their vote on the same day. It has huge impact. We've already seen the winnowing down of the enormous Democratic field, for example, but now we expect to see a further tightening to maybe a small cluster of candidates, 3 or 4 perhaps, although who knows, it's a very unusual election cycle to say the least. But we'll have up to a third of the overall delegates that will be selected in this process are at stake on Super Tuesday, Stephen. And what's different this time around is it's 14 states, 2 of which usually had their own primary, Texas and California, huge states. Huge numbers of delegates at stake, right. And they will be up for grabs. Super Tuesday also, we should know, comes after a weekend in which South Carolina has its primary, which is seen as crucial for former Vice President Joseph Biden, for example. So we have that vote taking place and then followed quickly by the Super Tuesday. Going into both of those, the frontrunner for the Democratic side was Senator Bernie Sanders, who is gaining a lot of attention as a frontrunner, as often happens, and a lot of attention paid to his past comments, whether it related to the Soviet Union or Cuba, as well as his ongoing abiding issue of health care for all, or radically overhauling the U.S. healthcare system, which resonates resonates with a lot of people, but he's been taken to task for not really spelling out how this is going to be paid for. His own co-progressive candidate, Elizabeth Warren, has pointed out that he hasn't been especially good at getting things done in the Senate, where she has been more sort of task-oriented and focused on plowing ahead and getting work done, and would herself come up with a similar type of plan that would cover more Americans than are currently being covered. So he touches on a lot of issues that resonate with Americans, especially progressives who are fired up in the same way that President Trump's base is fired up when he goes out on the hustings. It's going to be very interesting to see whether the Democrats emerge from Super Tuesday with a candidate that is divisive, which Senator Sanders is seen as being, or whether they have a new sort of pecking order that people need to take stock of.
Well, it's certainly clear that Senator Sanders seems to have a lot of momentum going into the South Carolina primary and Super Tuesday. The question really is that whether, if, some of the models are showing that if he wins just 45% of the delegates in Super Tuesday, there's no way that anybody else is going to catch him. And then, his opponents, if you take out Senator Elizabeth Warren, and then you think of Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Senator Amy Klobuchar, and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and then even add Tom Steyer, who is a businessman who's also running, that is a big moderate, quote unquote, moderate bloc.
Right.
But none of them have any intention of getting out of the race. And because they're splitting, the moderate, Senator Sanders and all the energy is on the progressive wing of the party. It certainly will be interesting. Another thing that's interesting to note is real lack of any discussion about foreign policy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Stephen.
Other than tagging
Despite my best efforts, by the way.
Yes. Other than tagging Senator Sanders for his praise of Fidel Castro's literacy program, or criticizing Mayor Bloomberg for declaring that Xi Jinping is not a dictator, there really hasn't been a serious discussion about American foreign policy, at least in the last 3 or 4 debates. There was some discussion after the killing of Qasem Soleimani about the role of the United States and the prospects of conflict between the United States and Iran. But other than that brief moment, this primary has been essentially foreign policy free.
Yeah, and a little discussion during the most recent debate in South Carolina about responses to a pandemic, to a coronavirus pandemic, and what would happen. What will be interesting to see, having, we just went over that issue could very well cascade as this campaign intensifies. You could have a relatively rare case of the world sort of impinging on a, intense domestic affair, this campaign. And you'd have candidates, as you've started to see with, say, former Vice President Biden, who helped in the Obama administration's efforts against Ebola, for example, or somebody like Mike Bloomberg, who's touted his role after 9/11 in New York City as being sort of the take charge candidate who can help get the trains running and galvanize the country to respond to this massive crisis. That will be interesting to watch, but the trends don't indicate it's going to be a factor.
No, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a factor in this. And of course, this is a really important moment in American foreign policy that deserves attention. But Americans are focused on issues like healthcare and education and things along those lines.
Well, Stephen, the world does continue to turn, and our Twitter poll has captured that in terms of the figure of the week. The response was, I would say, a landslide response to our Twitter poll this week, which is dozens killed in Delhi riots. So, Stephen, why did our Twitter audience pick that as a figure of the week?
Well, because dozens have been killed in the Indian capital in what are essentially religious-based riots. And let me just give a shout out to our colleague Alyssa Ayers, who's a senior fellow who knows more about India and Pakistan and that region than anybody. And she's a terrific resource. And I direct everybody to her commentary on what the situation is. Coinciding with President Trump's visit to India, there has been an outbreak of religiously inspired rioting in which Hindus, which is the majority in India, and Muslims have squared off in the streets of India's capital, and dozens of them have been killed in this communal violence. This is not the first episode in India's history. There has been a significant amount of violence perpetrated against the Muslim minority. It's hard to talk about a Muslim minority in India, given the fact that there are hundreds of millions of Muslims in India. But it is something that has happened sporadically. And one of the reasons for it happening now is the fact that the Indians have passed under the leadership of Narendra Modi, who is a Hindu nationalist, a citizenship law. And it has raised questions in the minds of the Muslim minority in the country whether they are actually citizens of India. And this has raised significant tensions, and it has unfortunately spilled out into violence. Unfortunately for President Trump, it happened while he was there and when he was praising Narendra Modi for his religious openness. So it was not a great look for the United States, but it really it's something that coincided with the president's visit. It did not happen because of the president's visit.
Yeah, and some commentators have said both leaders actually kind of missed an opportunity to display some statesmanship and just come up with some sort of statement about trying to calm what's happened and expressing remorse for those victims and so forth. The other concerning thing that will be worth watching going forward is reports that police in New Delhi sort of stood by and did not intercede to stop the violence against Muslims.
Once again, this is something that has happened in India before when it comes to this type of violence between Hindus and Muslims, and that the police have been, let's just say, not proactive in preventing the violence. I think the U.S. response has been, these are issues that are internal to India and that the president did not want to interfere with them and did not want to upset what is, by all measures, a very good relationship with Narendra Modi, who is the leader of a very, very important country. But it is, I think, as you point out, there was an opportunity for Modi in particular, as rioting was going on in his capital, to make statements to try to calm the situation. But of course, he comes from this, strongly Hindu nationalist political movement, and it would be hard for him to do that. Bob, what's your figure of the week?
Stephen, my figure is a number. It's a rather large one, 3 million. That's the estimated number of Syrians who have now flocked into the Idlib area in northern Syria and are facing in a civil war, 9 years and counting, that has seen some of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in modern history, is about to see another one potentially. Many of them are women and children. There are, in some places, interspersed some rebel fighters. This is the last sort of rebel redoubt against the Assad regime. But to be clear and to reinforce that many reports coming out of the region, indiscriminate attacks that are happening are hitting by and large civilians and many women and children. There is a lack of shelter in the cold weather. There are children freezing to death in the cold, and there is really no place for them to go. It's occurring at a time when the international community could not be more sort of stiff-necked against refugee in terms of allowing refugees into their countries. Turkey, it must be said, has been for years hosting more than 3 million refugees, I believe, Stephen, as you know very well, and has closed its border. It is involved in the region itself, and that could be the subject of a whole separate discussion, frankly. But we're in a situation of crisis, and it doesn't look encouraging in terms of what the UN Security Council or any other major actors could do to try to alleviate the suffering of these people.
It is truly one of the worst disasters ever. It is very, very hard to look at those pictures. Yeah. And given what I do, I've been paying attention to what's been going on in Idlib, and the videos and the pictures that are coming out of this area are just frightening, and quite frankly, they're shameful.
Yeah.
The Assad regime, along with the Russians, have been grinding up innocent people. The Turks have tried to intervene, and because there's not a lot of goodwill for Turks in Washington, there's not a lot of real effort on the part of the United States to help the Turks, who are now basically facing the Russians and the Syrians alone, but at the same time don't believe that they can handle an influx of another 3 million desperate people. It is a humanitarian disaster on a scale that is, quite frankly, unimaginable, except for those heartbreaking photos of children and their mothers dying in freezing weather along the side of roads as they're packed into this corner of Syria.
I would just say it is not like it's happening sort of in a vacuum. It's actually worth noting today the two main papers of record in the United States, Washington Post and New York Times, both prominently on their front page have big reports from the field covering what's happening there. There's no excuse for officials to say they didn't realize and know what was happening.
Right. It's really one of those issues which we will look back on, and we will wonder, I think, why countries did not take action in order to assist these people.
Stephen, it's been a grim string. Who or what is your figure of the week?
Well, my figure of the week is Mohammed Hosni Mubarak, who ruled Egypt for almost 30 years. President Mubarak died this past week. Many people didn't think that he would die anytime soon, despite having spent the last 3 weeks in the intensive care unit in a hospital. People believed he would live forever. Those were some of the things that people talked about in Egypt before he fell ignominiously in February 2011. I think that Mubarak's legacy is one that is mixed. There was a tremendous transformation of Egypt between the time he took the oath of office on October 14th, 1981, and when he was forced from power in February 2011. The country had developed in extraordinary ways, but of course, not everybody benefited from this economic development. Later...
And you were in Tahrir Square. You saw the outpouring, the venting of emotion.
I was in Tahrir Square at the beginning part of the uprising against Mubarak, and people really had enough of the Mubarak era, whereas he started out in a way that was, I think, think, a significant change from the deeply polarizing Sadat era and tried to bring stability to Egypt. His coda about stability for the sake of development over time led him to manipulate the country's constitution, led to crony capitalism, led to the prominence of his family members, most notably his second son, Gamal Mubarak, who people believed in the years prior to the uprising against Mubarak that he was going to be anointed the next president of Egypt. Clearly, Mubarak had outweighed his welcome. Even though he came to office saying he would use Egypt's emergency measures lightly over time, he never actually lifted them, and over time, the security forces became even more coercive. Of course, it's nothing in comparison to what Egyptians are experiencing now under Abdel Fattah Sisi, where Egypt is profoundly repressive, and that's part of the mixed legacy of Hosni Mubarak. Because I think that if people look back on it and they're honest with themselves, it was safer for them in 2010 to express their political views than it is for them to express their views in 2020. There's far more political prisoners in Egypt now than there was under Mubarak. That's not to excuse Mubarak. I think what we're seeing in Egypt now is a logical extension of the Mubarak period. Still, I think he will, given the longevity of his rule and how Egypt fundamentally changed in a variety of ways, I think his legacy will actually be quite mixed. There are some positive things that came out of the Mubarak era, of course, overshadowed by a deepening authoritarianism, a willingness to use force against people, corruption, police brutality, and crony capitalism.
Worth noting some extreme radical movements and sentiments emerging from Egypt's prisons over the years, as well as some of the 9/11 plotters.
Yeah, I think that it's clear that that kind of extremism that we have been contending with over the course of the last 2 decades are things that predate Mubarak's rule. Yeah. Of course, Egypt was an incubator of these ideas, and that some of the all-stars of transnational terrorism came from Egypt. But Mubarak's own efforts to manipulate extremist groups, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, to advance his own political interests and those of the then ruling National Democratic Party, had significant and negative consequences on Egypt and the world. But it is extraordinary, his passing. I think people didn't really believe that he would ever die. There's always Mubarak. Like the Sphinx, there's always Mubarak. That's our look at the world next week. Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. The United States and the Taliban are anticipated to sign a peace agreement, something rather extraordinary. Argentine President Alberto Fernandez is set to deliver the State of the Nation address, and the Hindu New Year is celebrated.
Please subscribe to The World Next Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a review while you're at it. It helps us get noticed and improve the show. Please note that opinions expressed on The World Next Week are solely those of the hosts or our guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. Today's program was produced by Zoe Collis with senior producer Jeremy Sherlick. Special thanks to Anu Kumar and Catherine Pape for their assistance. This week, our recording engineer was Anthony Laberi. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons.
This is Stephen Cook saying thanks and goodbye.
This is Bob McMahon saying thanks, Stephen, for joining us, and so long.